Uh, so again, the topic that we're dealing with is licensing. Uh, Licensing is actually the defining characteristic of OER, as you'll come on. And I mentioned yesterday that there were certain issues in for newbies when they get exposed to OER in terms of oftentimes having difficulties mastering the components necessary in order to use OER effectively. One was being able to find OER. Another one is the licensing around OER. And this is just meant to be an overview of it. This is a Creative Commons certificate is available that I believe is a week-long process that goes through this thing here. Uh, so the general overview of what we'll be discussing is the philosophy of OER, the paradigm shift um, that it is, some of the legalities and ethics associated with using OER, and then we'll discuss a practical application behind that. Now, just like yesterday, when I recommended if you want to write down anything that you write down this one specific URL, the same thing applies here. If you want to save anything, you want to save the specific URL. I have pasted that URL into uh, the chat for those of you that just came in that didn't see the chat. You can take a look at it now. And this right here is the chooser that I referenced yesterday that's useful in order to be able to explore and what type of license you want for a OER resource that you have created, that you have the intellectual property rights for. I will be going over it briefly, but I encourage you to take a look at it when you can. So let's start by defining what OER is. Well, it's open educational resources. The acronym is pretty straightforward. There are two definitions that are used out there. One is the William and Florence Hewlett Foundation. This definition has been around for a while because the Hewlett Foundation was pivotal in terms of building the OER infrastructure that you know today. And their definition is the open educational resources. OER are free and openly licensed educational materials that can be used for teaching, learning, research, and other purposes. It's a nice general overview of these things. Though the thing that I want to emphasize here is what's bolded is the openly licensed. So the definition of OER here is defined in terms of the license aspect. In addition to how you can use it. And then they have the argument of free here. Now, in 2019, UNESCO, after about a 7 to 8 year review period, which is standard for the UN in terms of processing things, came out with their definition, which is very similar. Open educational resources are teaching, learning, or research materials that are in the public domain or released with intellectual property licenses that facilitates the free use, adaptation, and distribution of resources. Uh, and that's a nice definition in order to work off. Two, this one includes the option of having things in the public domain, which complements the open licensing component that you have here. But the one thing that's particularly important is this free from the perspective that we have here. So many people interpret OER to not necessarily mean that OER has to be free. Has to be freely available for students in order to be able to find. In fact, you can, using Creative Commons licensing, create OER that is proper OER by these definitions, but is walled in with a paywall such that you need to pay in order to get access to it. And that's a growing issue that you'll notice in the OER landscape, sometimes called open washing, where you actually take things that are meant that we feel ethically should be distributed freely, put it around paywalls, and then make a commercial, make money off of that, profit off of that. And I have very strong opinions regarding that, as do many other people in the open community. I emphasize this because this has been a point of contention in defining OER. And no doubt, if you actually look around as you grow in your OER experience, you'll find organizations that are really for profit that value the money aspect over the mission aspect. LibreText does not fall into that category because we're not for profit, and that should be obvious for anyone who interacts with us. That we value mission over money. So, open licensing is is a key component in terms of defining OER. So we need to address these things. So what exactly is an open license? Well, an open license allows content to be free, as in freedom of speech, or free to be able to use as you want, but not necessarily free from cost, like I mentioned before off here. So the idea behind an open license is once you create material, you are the intellectual property owner of that material, the IP owner. And that means that you can do what you want with that material because you have full control over that. And open licensing is an infrastructure that basically gives you the ability in order to say, I allow people to use my material subject to certain requirements. So I oftentimes liken it to, when you're in college and you'll sometimes throw a couch out onto the street with a sign that says free. Since I'm in a college town, I see that all the time at the end of the school year. And then someone can pick it up and go. So it's basically saying, look, I own this, but you can take it and you can use it as you want. And it's the ultimate manifestation of what I refer to as sharing is caring, which is basically what OER is. That you create it and you want to share it. Because if you're not sharing it, what's the point of giving it away or providing the opportunity for people to use it effectively? That's openly licensed. If you noticed before in the Hewlett definition, it was also included a public domain. Public domain is the absence of a license. It is OER also, because it follows all the general rules of being able to be distributed and such, but it doesn't carry any restrictions in terms of what you're allowed to do. Now, public domain is a bit more complicated in terms of what country you're in and what is allowed to be public domain and not. But by and large, the argument behind public domain is that once something is created, you own the intellectual property rights for a certain fixed period of time. And then after that time is over, it's oftentimes a set number of years after the death of the intellectual property owner, then that content is released to the general public. In other words, it's meant for the public in order to benefit from that material and move forward. As many of you may be aware of, about a half a year ago, the original Mickey Mouse from Steamboat Willie entered the public domain. So that if you were to use that Mickey Mouse, you can use it without any issues associated with without Disney coming in with their attorneys in order to be able to cause these issues and such. There are a few other aspects that they're working with trademarks, but that's a different issue and such that. There is a third category that's particularly important to emphasize, or at least mention, but I'm not going to be talking in too much detail, which is called fair use. And fair use is a middle ground between all rights reserved, which means that the intellectual property owner isn't giving any rights out, versus you're allowed to take and use some of those materials under certain conditions. Now, fair use is flexible. It's sometimes ill-defined. I tend to stay away from it because it doesn't have the protections associated with a explicit license like the Creative Commons licensing that I'll be discussing in more detail. Although there are other licensing infrastructures out there than Creative Commons. For example, the new free document license, or the new predates Creative Commons licensing, and a few other people have created their own custom licensing. So licensing are essentially important in terms of designate these things. So I mentioned this several times. I will emphasize this clearly. OER doesn't technically represent free. So just because someone creates OER doesn't mean that they are obligated to freely distribute that content. But if you get access to that content in one way or another, then you're able to use it effectively. That's out there. And the reason that things sometimes get confusing in the English language is that English does not separate the term free that's used in liberty versus the free associated with cost. English, we call it both free. In the Romance languages, they are able to separate the two. Liberty, which has the root called a root of Libra, which is hence where Libra comes in, is the argument or the ability in order to operate without restrictions, not necessarily to provide things without cost. In the Romance languages, those are typically gratis or gratis. That is again rarely used in the English language. So open is the opposite of closed. Open is free from a liberty perspective, but the question ultimately when you're talking about licensing is just how free does it have to be? So what are the restrictions associated with the licenses? And this is where things get gnarly off of that. And then when you do distribute things freely, there's also a question about just how free it happens to be. I mentioned this yesterday that there's an associated cost with everything in OER, whether that cost is borne up front or put in the back, or how much that cost happens to be is the issue at hand, not if things are actually truly free. And that applies to many, many different aspects out there. So I gave you some formal definitions of OER, the Hewlett definition and the UNESCO definition. But to go into a little bit more detail of this, I'll introduce what David Wiley introduced about 15 to 20 years ago when he was defining what OER was, which is an acronym that he came up with and was referred to as the 5 R's, the 5 R's of OER. So Okay, here we go. It didn't show up. So those R's are retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. You talk to other people, you talk to people from time to time in the community, we'll sometimes add additional R's onto it in order to emphasize other aspects behind it. But nonetheless, I view the 5 R's of OER as the Constitution. So essentially, for something to be OER, you need to it needs to have the check mark of all the 5 R's in order to be able to process. And some of this was reflected in those definitions. Some were not. So retain is the first R. So that's the ability in order to hold the content in its unaltered original format. So that's then the ability in order to download a PDF and keep that PDF on your computer. That is one right. And for example, if you were to download something from Pirate Bay, a video of Cars 2, and you store it on your computer, you don't have that right to store that on your computer. You are violating the intellectual property rights of Disney in terms of that. And that is a key component, is to be able to retain things. The ability to reuse means that you can retain it for your personal archives, and you have the ability to make, own, and control the copies of that content. You can download, duplicate, store, and manage, not just retain the content on your system. So you can actually distribute it within these contexts off of here. Revise. So the revise option is the ability in order to take the content and to go in and edit the content as you need it, for whatever reason that you want. So this is sometimes referred to as adaptations or adapt. So you can adapt, adjust, modify, alter the content, translate, do whatever you want with it if you have the ability in order to revise. Remix, which is going to be the topic of conversation tomorrow, is the ability in order to take content from different sources and bring it together in order to build something new. That's remixing. That's the right to combine the original with revised content with other material, and to make something that you can say is your own. And I use the term own very loosely here because the idea behind intellectual property ownership, or the concept behind open licensing, is that the original intellectual property, the original source's intellectual property ownership, is still retained by the creator. It's just that you have to use it within certain criteria in your remixing, but you don't technically own it. As long as you follow the criteria of the license, you can use it de facto, but not legally. Uh, Lastly is redistribution. So you have the ability in order to take the content that you've created, that you've remixed or that you haven't remixed, and distribute it as broadly as you want. You know, you can give a content to your friend. You can find someone that you're walking down the street and give them a copy of what you've created. And that is one of the explicit R's that you need in order to be able to do. So these are universally agreed upon definition of OER. Other people like to add on other components to it, but again, you'll notice here that technically the definitions or this constitution does not include having it as a free resource that anyone can grab and run with. I emphasize that subtlety because that again is growing in the community with these for-profit companies that are open washing material. So this right here is a paradigm shift. It causes an issue that people have from what we're used to operating. Because in academia, we're used to the concept of you take something, you write something, it is your precious. Uh, you may want people in order to look at, but you don't want people to necessarily be able to edit because your name is connected to it. So you have certain protections that you want to have onto it. And it's not the way that we tend to operate. In a business perspective, it's the same thing. So from the business world, we're used to actually having something that we sell. And if we give it away for free, it makes it difficult in order to sell the material. And this is one of the issues that many people in the OER community that are trying to operate for-profit businesses, or even not-for-profit businesses like us that need some level of revenue in order to maintain sustainability, is to try to find out how exactly do you maintain support of what you've constructed when the material that you're intrinsically creating or hosting is meant to be free, or at least ethically. One aspect behind there I mentioned is to actually not give it away free, to put a barrier around that. And you'll find that in many circumstances, many companies that say they have OER, but you have to pay $35 a term in order to have access to it. Like I said, that's technically allowed, but it's a little bit of a mismatch of the ethics that are behind on it. So adopting OER is a paradigm shift because it changes the way academic world thinks. It changes the way publishing world thinks, and basically the way most business models operate. So one of the examples that I will mention, but it's useful in order to discuss here, is that someone adopts an open license. What they are doing is they're saying, I own the content. I'm allowing other people to use that content subject to certain criteria. Now, the paradigm shift is that as long as people follow that criteria, you have no say in how they use it. And that's where people get a little uncomfortable with because they believe traditionally that once they create it, they have the rights to say, oh, you can use it, but you can't use it. You can use it, but you can't use it for this situation. And the paradigm shift associated with open is no, is that when someone has a Creative Commons license on a document, as long as you're compliant with the licensing requirements, and I know I've said that multiple times, we'll get into that momentarily, then you have no say in what they use it for. It could be the most reprehensible political statement that's using what you're doing that you actually fight against, but as long as they are using it within your license, you are unable to complain. Actually, you can technically complain, but you can't actually stop them from being able to do that. Now, like I said, Creative Commons licensing is a complicated issue. It takes many, many days in order to be able to go through that. We're just going to go through the topical aspects behind it. If you have questions or concerns behind any aspect behind it, I love to be able to get into greater conversation. We've been working in this field for 16 years, and we've dealt with essentially every single aspect of application of Creative Commons licensing. And in many circumstances, we failed, and then we learned from our failures in order to be able to move forward. So, like I said, when you think of open licenses, think of it as putting a sign out in front of your material that says free stuff off of here. By the way, this slide deck is already uploaded into the conductor page, so you can download it right now if you like. So I already mentioned that that open licensing is confusing, and that is very much true. So, like I described, there's public domain, and I believe this date is should be updated to 1927, not 1924. I think it's I'm not up on the exact date when things became public domain. Uh, so when things are public domain, that means that you can do anything you want without any restrictions, period. No problem. Um, Predating Creative Commons, the open licensing infrastructure that was used out there was the GNU, or the new open licensing. That's still used out there. It's really quite effective for code or programming. It was less useful for content, and it has a few other issues that are particularly concerning to people. But you'll still find this from time to time out there. This was the original licensing of Wikipedia, uh, and it was in, I believe, 2014, 2013 that they switched over to the Creative Commons licensing, which basically handles 98, 99% of all OER material out here. And that's what we're going to be focusing on before. And that's also what that link, that chooser link that I pasted off here, that will step you through in order to be able to discuss the aspects behind Creative Commons licensing. The nice thing about Creative Commons licensing, which is nice from a legal perspective, but adds complexity, is that it has been changing and evolving. So there are multiple versions out there as it starts to hone the needs that are out there, and it's still constantly changing, even though it hasn't done a full revision, I believe, in about a decade. So, um, like I said, open licensing as used has requirements. It's basically saying you can use this as my intellectual property as long as you do these things, and you have to enumerate the things, and then you make it explicit off here. So all of the Creative Commons licensing has a requirement for attribution, which basically means the equivalent of a byline in academia. So you created it. If you use it, you need to put my name on it, because I created it, you use it, my name needs to be on it, period. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be at the top or defined of whatever remix you did there, but it has to be clearly indicated somewhere that says, this is my resource. I was the one that created it. Please give me credit for what we're doing. And that right there, again, is the baseline that we have here. So whenever you use material that's openly licensed, at least via Creative Commons licensing, and also for the new licensing, you always need to find out who made it and make sure that they're attributed appropriately. So the second one is share alike. And this is where some of the complexities are involved here. And it's basically saying that you assign a specific license to your intellectual property. And if someone else takes that license and remixes it and builds something new with it, they are not allowed to change the license that's on this. Now, that may sound kind of weird to you, because it certainly sounds weird to me, that you can change the license of the content. And that, as described, is not entirely what's involved in open licensing, but it has the de facto application behind that. So in other words, you have the ability, in order to mix and match content with different licenses, and then you apply a new license on top of that. That is the term remixing that Creative Commons uses for describing that new mixture. I'll contrast that with a different approach that's called a collection momentarily. But this right here makes things a little bit messy in terms of building things. The third criteria, or third possible restriction, is adding a non-commercial clause to your license. So it's basically saying that anyone can use your material, subject to, assuming you have attribution, which you have to, so they have your name onto it, but they can't use it to make a profit. I want to be clear off of here. Of all the Creative Commons licenses that are out there, only one has ever gone to court in order to be tested in the legal phrase. Anyone can create anything they want, but until it's tested in court, it's difficult in order to evaluate the full legal application of that. earlier last decade, this was tested in court, the specific clause off of here, and it was interpreted in terms of not necessarily be non-commercial, but to be non-profit. Uh, so as long as someone is using your material, if you have non-commercial clause on it, if they're using the material and not making a profit off of it, if they're getting revenue in order to maintain the infrastructure and distributing it appropriately, they are not in violation of the non-commercial clause, and they are in compliance with the licensing that's out there. It's a misnomer that comes in with the title off of here. It's out there, but please be aware that it's not technically for non-commercial purposes, even though many people in the community seem to think that's the case because that's the title. The last one, which is the bane of people in OER, is the no derivatives clause. So if you tack a no derivatives clause onto your open license, your Creative Commons license, what you're saying is you can't change it. That's it. You can use it. You provide attribution, provide non-commercial, share alike, but you can't make a derivative of it. You are allowed to change the format of it, so you can convert it into different formats, and you are actually allowed to do snippets of it, but you into different contexts, but you can't actually change the content off of. That means that if someone has intellectual property that is no derivative claused on it, and there's a mistake in it, you can't fix it. This isn't a violation of the 5 Cs that I mentioned before. So that means that if you use a Creative Commons license that has a no derivative clause on it, it is not OER, not following the definition that we have here, even though it's Creative Commons licensing. So these are the 4 clauses that have, and working alone, they're not too confusing. The issues is trying to mix and match content from different sources that have these licenses, and then how do you actually deal with them effectively? So I have a hard time. I can't see people's responses here. Are people's eyes glazing over with these issues? Are you guys cool with what we're doing? We still have a bit more conversation that's going to be reinforcing these concepts, not necessarily introducing a lot of new concepts. I just want to make sure that we are all on track here. Part of the issues associated with doing things online instead of being able to actually look at your faces and see how these are moving. Let's take a look here. There's a question that Alex said. This is helpful. Maybe okay. This is just a slide issue. So Rebel commented that we are more open in our definition of open. Is this in context to Florida, or we as in the community, or your family? Do you want to chime in terms of how you use it differently than what I mentioned?
I don't know if I can jump in, but we define in a spectrum in Florida. So we allow the no derivative. That's us personally. So we support OE. We consider OER and then that are have non-derivatives as well. Um, we believe in supporting our authors and their choices, and there may be reasons why they chose no derivatives for their content, and they may not be restrictive to working on, modifications or additions with people. They just might want to have a say in what those modifications and new additions are. So um, we still feel like that brings it to an open education. It provides it free to faculty and students to use in their classroom. They just need to use it as is. And there are cases where that is important. One of the ones that we use as an example is with Indigenous works and Indigenous content and bringing in those Indigenous voices. Sometimes we don't want that content to be changed or modified from their original perspective.
Right. So there are plenty of reasons why ND should be around. Uh, uh, and while I commented that technically following the 5 Rs, if you have an ND license on it, you're not OER. It does not mean it's not functionally useful in the classroom. So this introduces this question this hypothetical question that I often ask people, is that if all commercial products were free for students, would you actually get involved in OER? So in other words, if things were still not openly licensed but were free for students or open access, would you still pursue the open OER aspect that's associated with these things? And many people would actually say no, because the impact that we have, or the impact that many people want, is to have the resources that are freely available to the students. And it doesn't matter whether it's open OER or not OER, the benefit for the students is the same. In other words, the students don't care whether it's OER or not OER. We may have other reasons why we care about that, customization, other things that we want to be able to do out there. But it's important in order to recognize that these licenses are not the definitions of utility, and there are reasons in order to be able to do that. We tend to have very few content on our site that's ND. So like I said, we are allowed to harvest, that is to bring in existing content that's ND licensed, as long as we don't modify it. We are just basically changing the format of it. And you can mix and match that content in pages in order to do that, or even do snippets inside these pages that are connected to it. So thank you, Rebel. That's an important aspect in order to emphasize. So uh, Tom asked a question, what is your preference for content that you create? Are you asking me or are you asking Rebel? So the content that I create, uh, actually, so let me address that question in a moment. First, let me put this thing on a spectrum. And this is what Rebel actually mentioned here. So if you were to look at the licenses that are available, Uh, you can see these things as 6 basic licenses that Creative Commons provides, with 2 additional licenses. One is all rights reserved, which is not technically a Creative Commons licensing, and the other one is what they call CC0. That's just functionally public domain. So you can look at the spectrum in terms of what is available, where in one end, the most open is just public domain, no restrictions at all, and the least open is all rights reserved. And then you have a combination of these things, which is basically arguing how many different restrictions you have that's connected to these things. Um, so you'll notice again, buy is on all these licensing. That's not much of an onerous request for these things. So the most open license in Creative Commons licensing is CC BY. If you put share alike on it, you're basically saying you can only have this license, you're not changing, and these are considered to be the most open. Uh, then if you go down, you can have a restriction on NC, and that right there starts to cut things down a little bit. And then you have the ND, which is even more restricting that's out there. Um, so functionally, I view OER through the landscape of LibreText, because that's a manifestation of how I view OER. So for most purposes, with the exception of the ND clause, as long as you use things on the LibreText in the effective manner, it really doesn't matter if it's CC BY or share alike or CC BY NC or CC BY NC share alike, because the way that we actually operate, first, we're not selling it for a profit. So we don't have any limitations off of here. Second, we provide attributions for everything. So that's not a limitation off of here. And third, we have a system set up in order to provide auto attributions that essentially can generate what's called collections. I'll define that in a moment, such that we'll be addressing the share alike issue also. So in other words, as long as I do everything in the LibreText, I actually don't care what licensing is connected to it. And that causes a little bit of confusion by people who want to actually come in and say, what is the license of your book? And oftentimes the license of a book may have multiple licenses of content inside of it. And we're very honest in presenting those licenses to people in order to make sure that they can operate within the compliance of the licensing their material. If you actually take a close look at OER that's out there, much of the OER is not compliant with Creative Commons licensing. An obscene number of material out there is not compliant with the way things are working. Now, most people care about the intent than the actual logistics. It's not that big of an issue, but we've had problems in the past, legal problems with things that were not synced up exactly right, and we had to address. So, in answer to your question, um, what license do I prefer? I typically just do CC BY. In the past, when I was more aggressive against commercial products, I always had the NC clause on it. Um, I have been, there are people who are very much aggressive if you have anything with the NC clause on it. It's all a function of what you prefer, but as long as you use everything in the LibreText, it really functionally doesn't matter. So I mentioned the word collection a couple times. So this is where things get a little bit confusing, and it's confusing in my brain because I don't fully understand um, the these things. Sarah, you asked a question. Could I please repeat it? Are you asking what I prefer, or do you want me to repeat something else? Okay, thank you. Okay, so remixes versus collections. So I use the term remix to mean taking content from different sources and bringing them together. So that's collectively the term remixing. But within the Creative Commons landscape, the term remixing has a very specific context. And it's basically taking content from different sources and applying a single license to what's created. If you're allowed to do it, and you may not be allowed to do that. And that is what a remix is. So you take it from more than one source, you apply a single license to the product, and then that's that. So the LibreText infrastructure is set up in order to apply a license at the page level. Every single page, you can select what license you want connected to that. And that's important. And then every single block on that page has the ability in order to have the license that you put onto it. And you can modify blocks with different licensing if you want, but we don't encourage you to do so because it gets quite messy. So that is a remix. A collection takes content from more than one source. It applies no license to the resulting product. So in other words, it's saying that this is a collection and the licensing of each of the component of the collection is indicated out there. And that makes things easier for us, in part because we can avoid some of the complexities associated with using Creative Commons licensing, specifically being able to change the license, and I use the term change very loosely here, in order to give it one single license. In other words, if we know everything on a book is a single license, for example, if I brought everything from an OpenStax book, I know it's all CC BY or CC BY and C share alike. A few of their books are the latter. I know that every single resource, every single image, every single text is licensed like that, and I feel comfortable assigning a license to that book. But if I know that some of the pages of that book come from different licenses, I don't like to change the license for it, even if Creative Commons licensing provides me the opportunity for doing so. Uh, so that might be a little bit confusing, and it's useful in order to go through a few tricks in order to be able to get that. So what we have introduced into the LibreText is a more granular perspective on licensing, and we did this over 16 years of development, implementation, and lots of consultation with the Creative Commons licensing team in terms of what we can do and what we can't do and how we go about doing it. We're very happy with what we do because I think it's the most detailed, albeit most complicated infrastructure in the OER community out there, but it's the most honest and the most transparent in the way we go about doing things. So one thing that we have implemented here, and I mentioned this yesterday, is our auto attribution feature. Our auto attribution feature allows us to be able to take content from different sources onto a page, and it comes automatically with its attribution. And in order to show you an example of that, this right here is a page that has content from 3 different sources. Now, unfortunately, something tweaked here and the authorship is not showing up, which was be fixed very quickly because that's not in compliance. But what we have here is we have this page, and this page, I can assign a specific license to it. So I'm going to assign a license of CC BY, and I'm going to give it 4.0, which is the preferred license off here. So that's the license on the page. Now, that may not necessarily be the license of the content that's used on that page. This is part of the funky stuff associated with Creative Commons licensing. Um, the content here was cut and pasted from three different pages. If you look at the bottom here, the auto attribution button tells you what is the content, sorry, what is the attribution aspect for the page, which is auto attribution example. That's the title. Is shared on CC BY 4.0. It has a link that's automatically added. That's a requirement for Creative Commons licensing. It's authored, remixed, or curated by LibreText. And if I have if I have a source, I can add that to this page with a simple metadata. But I'm not doing it here because it then automatically grabs the attribution of the content on other pages that were brought in. So I brought from three different sources here, and it brought in the content, the attributions automatically for here. Like I said, the authorship is missing here, and I just noticed this bug today, so we're fixing this really quickly. So I can come in and I can say, well, this content comes from different sources. If I click this button here, it will color code where that content came from. So this content here came from confirmations of ethane. It's licensed by CC BY. Here's the original author of here. This one here it comes from Hun's rules determining state symbols of ground state examples. Is licensed by CC BY and such. And the attribute and the source should also be on here that's connected to it. So we can actually take snippets and mix things together, and we keep track of where it comes from in order to be able to do that. Martin asked the question, what does 4.0 represent? That is the version number. I said that Creative Commons licensing has gone through several iterations as it has honed and developed itself. 4.0 represents the state of development for Creative Commons licensing. 3.0 is still popular out there, and you'll rarely find anything less than 3.0. That's there. But sometimes you'll find it a little bit in really old things on Wikipedia and such. So the upshot that we have here is that the auto attribution system is set up in order to provide this attribution requirement exactly. And what we'll see is I have mixed three different contents: CC BY, CC BY NC share alike, and CC BY NC share alike 4.0. Again, to address Martin's perspective on this page. Now, in order to talk about what would be the license of the overall page, we got to talk about how licenses play well together. So let me go back to here. Nalanthe asked, are we required to do that LibreText if we remix and does? This is automatic if you copy and paste from different content. If you remix on our platform, if you remix off of our platform, the auto attribution doesn't work because it's not like that. And it's the most detailed approach for doing this that's out there. So, okay. Now here's the issue. Creative Commons licensing allows me to take a license of content on a page and change the license on that page of the page itself, of the product that I've created. The content itself is not changed in its license because I'm not the intellectual property owner, but someone else is. But the package that I put that page and the content onto, I can then rebrand. Rebrand in the sense of changing the license that's out there. Now, I've tended to find this hard to understand, not hard to understand, but I've never really liked this because I really don't feel that I'm comfortable re-representing the license of material that other people have selected the license for. It's their right in order to select the license of what they've created. So there is this thing called a compatibility chart. The ability in order to combine two licenses, let me phrase, the ability to combine content with two different licenses on a page and have the same license or single license applied to it. So for example, you may remember the share alike criterion. The share alike criterion means you cannot change the license of the page. You cannot put a license on the page to describe the content on the page that is different from the actual license of the content on the page. Let me describe this in a different manner because that didn't work very well. Let me go back to this this page that I was talking about here. Okay. On this page, I had content from three different sources, and they have two different licenses. These lower two ones have the same license that's out there. Uh, and you'll notice that both this one, oh, actually, this, sorry, I thought this was slightly different. So this one here is CC BY. This does not have the share alike clause, which means that I can actually change the title, not change the license of this page to be CC BY share alike. If I want, I can add a share alike clause on it, and I would not be in violation of the BY because the BY doesn't have a requirement to saying that's forced to take that license. However, this content right here is CC BY NC share alike. What that means is that I can only use CC BY NC share alike for this page. That if I were to change this license to CC BY for the page, that this is not compliant with this. And therefore, this is not a valid combination of licensing. If this is confusing to you, welcome to the ball game. This takes a bit of time in order to be able to master, and I encourage you to take a closer look at this outside of what I'm discussing here when you're actually remixing that's coming here. What we haven't introduced into the auto attribution, and we will in a few months, is a logic such that if you apply a license to the content to the page, it will check to see if that's compliant with the content that's out here. So on this page right here, I can't do CC BY share alike, but I can do CC BY share alike. Where are we? Um, I can do CC BY share alike NC. And now this is a valid combination of licensing because the license on the page is compliant with this line because the share alike clause is compliant with this one because this has no share alike clause, and you can modify that. This sort of game is reflected in this compatibility chart in terms of saying what you can mix together and what you can't mix together effectively. I encourage you to take a look at this. This is for making remixes. This is for making a single license to describe things. However, a collection is possible. I can come in here and I can designate this as a collection. And now the page itself has no license. And the only thing that's applicable is essentially the license of the content that's on the page. So that means I can use this page, even if I have content that's conflicting licensing, as long as I'm compliant with the requirements of the license of each of the IP here, which is largely the non-commercial clause, I am perfectly fine. And so this is what, getting back to Tom's question in terms of what licensing do I prefer, I don't care whether this is actually has a license on it as a remix or as a collection, and you deal with the licensing at the block level. Functionally, I can still operate in the same way possible. It has no impact. It does make things a bit more complicated in terms of how we operate. So what do I mean by complicated? So what I mean is something like this. I'm going to pull up a book by Anna Mills, just because, what is in here? And you'll see that this is how we deal with licensing for a book. So this is a book that at the page level, and right now we didn't talk about the block level, at the page level, it has 147 pages that are CC BY NC. It has 45 pages that are CC BY NC share alike. It has 30 pages that are undeclared. Those are probably collections. It has one page that's CC BY ND. So it doesn't have a single license. It has a spectrum of licenses that are out there. And this is how we reflect it by saying, well, these are the licenses that are applicable for this resource as constructed. You can go down and you can actually look at the content here of which licenses are each which page. This is reflected in the back of the book when it's compiled. And this is a more honest picture of the licensing aspects associated with this resource rather than giving it a single license that reflects these things. We identify the key components when we actually look at this saying, well, because you have a non-commercial clause on here, even if you have one image on it, you can't sell the book for profit. And then it emphasizes that there's a non-derivative clause off of here. So that means whoever owns that intellectual property of that material, we haven't edited it, but we're still allowed to use it in this collection. Now, I understand this may be a bit more complicated than most people can consume, but I want to be able to really emphasize how LibreText operates in terms of licensing. And the same thing applies, although to a smaller perspective, to adapt. So every question in adapt has a attribution connected to it. It's in the lower left-hand corner of every question that gives the attribution aspects associated with that. That's going to be expanded a little bit in order to provide attributions for the solution, attributions for the question, attributions for the images and things like that. But it will have a similar perspective of having a granularity that's more than just a single license for a complex structure, whether it's a book, a page, or even a question that has multiple blocks that's out there. So um, now, if I have more time, I oftentimes uh, talk about identifying the licensing of content. I think this is a good exercise to do in the breakout room. So I'll bring this thing up after lunch in order to deal with trying to identify the licenses on OER that's out there, because identifying the licensing is important. You cannot remix from content that you don't know the licensing of it, period, because you don't know if you have permission in order to be able to use it. And that's exceedingly important because there's a lot of content on the internet today that has no licensing indicated. And that is still hands off. You can't touch it because you don't know if it's openly licensed. So um, with that, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to skip over this compliance aspect that we had in place that we discontinued, but we're going to build back. I'm going to leave it at this for this conversation. Like I said, there's still lots of conversations available or to continue on the conversation. Still lots of opportunity in order to continue the discussion of open licensing during this meeting. There's lots of resources available off of here. I gave you this link for this chooser. So this is a good example in order to come in and say, you create something, go through this Creative Commons chooser and identify what would be the Creative Commons licensing that addresses your needs, your concerns. And those concerns may be non-derivative clause, like what Rebel mentioned, if you don't want people to be able to touch it for one reason or another. And I encourage you to play around and take a look at that. So with that, um, I can understand if there are questions that people may have or a need in order to take a break. So we have a few minutes before Tom takes the stage. I see a few questions into the chat, so I'm able to address it. Chris asks, what if you're also adding your own content to a given page? So if you make a new block and you write content on the page, the actual attribution of the page itself will be going to that new content. So you're able to reflect that. The other thing that I'll mention is, and this is going to be clear in day 4 when we deal with editing, is every single time that you save a page, you save a revision in the database. You can always go back to any previous version of the database and you can do comparisons between 2 different pages in order to see what type of edits have done. And that's useful in order to provide a history to anyone who has an interest in order to see how derivations have happened. I will mention that we deal with um, licensing at the block level, which is a paragraph level or an image level. We don't deal with it at the word level or the sentence level. So if you add a sentence into a paragraph that was from somewhere else, you're following the license of that content that's there. You can't substitute and say my sentence has a different license than the sentence next to it, because that just be very confusing for everybody. Uh, Nadia asks, can we say more about the people who are using the materials versus creating them? I'm worrying about messing up getting the materials for students to use. Do you think you can clarify that, Nadia?
Yeah, hi. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it's Nadia,
Nadia,
and
sorry.
no worries. Um, yeah, I think so I've used the materials from LibreText in a couple of ways. Sometimes I just take like an entire book, obviously, to share with students, and sometimes there's like a page maybe that I want
Mhm.
um to use and share with students. And so I think where I get confused is I mean, the depth of the licensure. Um, I want to make sure that I'm not providing materials to students if I take things out of context, perhaps. that is messing up the license. I'm just trying to figure out if I'm a user primarily rather than a creator,
Mhm.
at what depth should I become really familiar with these licensing types?
It's a really good question. It's basically asking how ignorant can you be and still maintain your sanity in this discussion here.
Yeah.
So at the bottom of every page of a LibreText page, a PDF, has our licenses indicated. So we put the license on every page, and at the end of the section of the PDF, the page that we have that attribution requirement. It's there everywhere. So we are transparent in various spots. It's not hidden. You don't click on it. It's always there. So if you actually take a PDF and you distribute it, parts of it like that, you're in full compliance with licensing. As long as, yeah, you're full compliance with licensing. As long as the content you didn't remix offline and do other issues.
Got you.
As far as a book, this at the end of this book here, there is a page up which is in the back matter called licensing information or licensing detail. I'm not entirely sure what it's titled, and it goes through every single page of the book and gives the license for every page. Uh, this takes a couple pages in very big books, but it's meant to say, look, you want to know what the actual licenses are. These are the licenses on our book, and you're 100% compliant with it. And it'll emphasize whether it has the non-derivative clause, sorry, the non-creative, the non-commercial clause, such that you can't sell that book, and otherwise. So at the book level, that should be handled appropriately.
Okay.
Um,
And so then the other question is, in the past I have, and this is when I was just getting to know about these materials,
mhm.
I have because I didn't want the entire page, so I basically like cut and copy and pasted the text, but then used the little attribution thing at the top,
Mm-hmm.
and then added that at the end of whatever I copied and pasted. Does that still cover?
Are you talking about copying it like in a Word document or some other
Yeah,
thing?
so like
Yeah,
in
that
Canvas,
that
right?
should be fine. So
Okay,
the best thing to do is at the bottom of the page has the attribution. So any page that we have,
okay,
so let me pull up a page. We have two types of attributions. The top one is what I call a branding bar, and this one here does not have a branding bar on it. And the bottom part is the attribution. So this right here. This was written before we actually did the updates, but it will have this section that's the full attribution that you should be able to copy and paste. Unless you see something clearly like this attribution component here, which supersedes this, and this is what the text wrote down here, and this just needs to be modified. This was remixed before we had the attribution. This was remixed even probably before we had the source that's out here. And I need to go in order to be able to modify this in order to be able to put it in context. But the attribution at the bottom is the legal attribution that we use, if applicable, not usurped by here. What we have at the top, which might be a branding bar, uh, which has a name off of here. This Anna doesn't have branding bars on here because she doesn't have her name on these pages, which we should probably fix. Again, because this is an older resource. That right there is only branding. It's not authorship. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but when you remix, you have the rights to call the remix your own. But many people feel uncomfortable to call it their own, that they're authors for it. So I call it a branding bar, not an author bar, that says I'm branding this as my own. But look at the bottom that will have the list of the names where the materials come from in order to be able to handle it appropriately. So, and there are a few tweaks that need to be done on this page in order to be able to handle it again because it's older. So, let's see here. Tom is telling me to chill. Chris, you're coming back again. I think we're getting to this tomorrow, but my understanding now is that if we get all resources from a library in LibreText and do the remixing, editing in LibreText, there's nothing to worry about. That's true. There are always a little bit of refinements, like the thing that I showed before, where they put the attributions at the bottom and it's not handled in the current one. But the way that we have it set up for by and large most purposes, the auto attribution system follows through and makes things easy for you in order to be able to do it. If you remix off of our platform and bring it back on our platform, then it becomes a lot more messy, and then it becomes similar to what other people, if you're doing on Pressbooks or other platforms that don't have anything like this, because no one else has anything like this, at least not to my knowledge. So any other questions or concerns? If you are still confused about licensing, that's perfectly justified. This is not an easy concept in order to do. Creative Commons is working with, or is trying to get courses in law schools around open licensing in order to be able to have a full discussion around this aspect in order to master. And there are always opportunities in order to get a certificate from the Creative Commons infrastructure. Well, from their workshops that they provide. I think they do it online, and they also do it in person if you have appropriate support. I think the state of California did work with them a little bit, or at least 20 Million Minds worked with them a bit in California in order to generate some workshops that are sort of mini Creative Commons certificate capable workshops.